So today we'll cover a couple of things. We'll start with the perception-awareness duality. It's really important for us to understand how perceptions affect our awareness and how awareness affects our perception. Finally, predictive index, that's the assessment that you all took. We'll talk through a little bit about the results, what they mean, particularly those three graphs, which are pretty much indecipherable at this point, and explain what those applications are. Again, the so what, so why did you make us take this assessment, and how can it be helpful for you in your roles and on your teams, and then we'll conclude with a little Q&A. So we'll start off with a little bit about perception. Does anyone want to offer what they see here in this picture?
I'm an artist, so it's cheating.
Yeah, same here.
A lady, look.
A lady, someone said a lady?
Yeah, like looking away.
Looking away, so we see the lady looking away. What else do we see? Is there anything else?
An old lady looking down.
Yes, that's correct. Do you see with the nose here, this kind of shawl, a feather? Do we all see that? Do we see both?
No.
No. Lupe, which one?
I just see the girl.
Okay, so this is an old lady looking this way. Eyes, nose, chin, shoulder, wrap around her head.
Squint at it. She's like, maybe close.
She's like, I just don't see it.
The choker is her mouth. So the choker
highlighter and just go.
Yeah, right. And actually, it took me a really long time to see the old lady too. I always see the girl when I look at this image, but there are two images, and the point is that we don't always see the same things. That others see even when we're looking at the same things. And so keeping that in mind, we'll use that as we explore today a little bit about ourselves, but then also how we can apply that to how we work with people and learn about how other people affect our behaviors and our perception of the world. These are just some quotes I wanted to share, some statistics about about the workplace and how the workforce is being affected by these behavioral, these things that are rooted in behaviors. For example, 66% of CEOs are cited talent-related issues as their top business challenges. 82% failure rate in choosing candidates for the right talent for a manager position. 82%, that's crazy, right? A survey of the top HR execs at 25 of the global of 50 found that 80% of external hires and 75% of promotions were disappointments. That's astronomical when we're talking about the promotion rate, hiring in general. Like, hiring is a regular thing that we do day to day, right? Like, we click on job boards all the time to see what opportunities might be out there when we're in search for perhaps a new transition. And so these things are really egregious that we need to work on. The final quote here: only 3 in 10 employees are actually engaged or involved in their work, which not really great. So what predicts executive success? Do we have any guesstimates? Self-awareness is the strongest predictor of overall success. So we'll explore a little bit about our own self-awareness today. So I love this image, this human. A lot of times we forget that it's human beings that are running our businesses. And so there are 3 parts here that we'll talk a little bit about with the concentration on the behavior or the drives which are in our head. PI, or Predictive Index, has a 3-pronged approach, which we call the head, the heart, and the briefcase. And so the head, or our drives, or cognitive ability, are the things that are fixed. These are things that we're born with, things that really don't change over time. Our personalities are formed when we're 4 years old. So as you can imagine, even as you grow and develop into adults, there are still things about our personalities that remain consistent. The other 2 things that we'll talk about, the heart and the briefcase, are what we'll call variable assets, or things that develop and change over time. Our values and interests sure can be somewhat informed by our cultures, our parents, our environments, our schooling, all of those things. But as we grow and continue to kind of move towards adulthood, those things can change. For example, as we get older, we tend to be more risk averse. When we're younger, we tend to seek risks versus perhaps when we get older and we're looking for more stability in our lives. And finally, the other variable asset would be the briefcase, or what we call knowledge, skills, and experience. So those are things like education, skills, how to type, how to code, things like that. And experience, of course, things that we acquire as we live our lives, and how that kind of amounts to that briefcase and what it represents. And so when we look at the whole person. This is who shows up to work. It's all of those things. It's not just our skills and experience. It's not just our values and interests. It's very much also what's going on in our head. And really, there's not a whole lot of products out there that really help understand what those things mean. There are a lot of assessments. I'll absolutely agree with that. But what Predictive Index does is take this three-pronged approach and uses those cognitive and behavioral drives to really help understand what a person can bring to their roles. Any questions so far? Great. Does it make sense? We on board with the logic? Okay, cool.
I do really like that graphic. That's
Thanks.
an
Right?
interesting way of putting it all together.
Absolutely. No, that's great feedback. Thank you. So what is the PI behavioral assessment? So this, again, is the assessment that everyone took prior to our session today. So it's essentially a behavioral assessment that helps us understand how someone responds to his or her environment and the people in it. It's really a measurement of drives. What are the things that inherently we respond to and the behavioral results that are produced? And that was what is shown in your report. The report is a list of behaviors, essentially, what people see are the observable things. It predicts aspects of job performance independent from knowledge, skills, or abilities. So that is, again, referring back to the difference between variable assets and fixed assets. And so PI is really focused on those fixed assets. We have over 2.5 million assessments administered annually. It is available in 70 languages, so it is a global product, and it takes approximately 6 minutes on average. And everybody cut around 6 minutes, shorter, longer? Right? Shorter. Okay, great, fantastic. And so how do we know this works, right? It sounds too good to be true, right? We actually have conducted over 500 validity studies on different positions and different organizations to help show and demonstrate that the science is actually relevant to job performance. And we continue to invest in ongoing research and testing as it relates to the applicability of the tool.
Random side question.
Yes.
Is this an assessment that we were able to do because you asked us to do it, or is this something that anybody can go on and do at any time if they were interested in it?
That's a really good question. So the assessment is offered online. If you go to predictiveindex.com, you can take the assessment. And what will happen is one of the PI certified partners, of which I am a member, will get your information, and then they'll reach out to you to conduct a readback, which is what we'll do today. Okay. And so typically we'll also use these types of forums to help educate people on their assessment and what it means.
Okay, awesome.
Great question. And so we'll talk a little bit now about what does PI measure. If everybody has their own assessments out or on their phone, feel free to pull it up. It's not required, but it might be nice to walk through your own assessment as we talk through these different drives here. And so speaking of drives, the PI measures 4 different factors or drives that we'll discuss. Dominance, extraversion, patience, and formality. And as you can see, everything exists on a spectrum, right? So that means we all have some amount of these behaviors. They're just expressed differently in each of us depending on our drives and our corresponding needs. And so as you look at these diagrams, you can see this little triangle thing here. That's what we refer to as the midpoint. So that's really the median of the expression of these drives. If you have a drive that falls to the right of the midpoint, it means that you have what's called a high expression. So in this case, with the D, it would be a high D. Anything to the left-hand side would be a low D, or a low expression of that factor. And so starting with dominance. Dominance is the drive to exert one's influence over people or events. So that basically means that you have that you tend to be more aggressive, assertive, have a need to drive. Factor B is what we call extraversion, the drive for social interaction with other people. Generally speaking, folks on the high side tend to be more extroverted, those on the low side tend to be more introverted, and again, it's all on a spectrum, so it's not like this person's an introvert and this person's an extrovert. It's all kind of in variance depending on the relationships and the nature of it. The third factor is patience, or the drive for consistency and stability. Again, high, low. And finally, D, or formality, the drive to conform to rules and structure. So these folks tend to be more detail-oriented, and those less so on that side. So how are, I don't know why that says that. How are we known? That said, how are we known? Like, that doesn't make sense. How are we known? Often it's only through our behaviors or what are observable to those around us. And so the source of behaviors are focused on drives. Drives are, again, those kind of innate things about ourselves that help us get through day in, day out. Can somebody give me an example of what a drive might be, a human drive?
To make money.
Perfect. It's a great one. Yeah.
Is to be happy to like ephemeral?
Oh, no. No, that's a very important one. Yes, to be happy. Absolutely. That's absolutely a drive.
To eat dinner.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. To survive. We need to eat to survive. Exactly. And so drives are really, our actions begin with our drives, right? Some are innate, some are learned. To make money perhaps is learned, but also can also be innate because in order to survive, we need to make money to buy things to sustain our livelihoods. I mentioned the drive to survive, right? If we need to survive, we need to eat food. So that would result in me walking across the street to get a sandwich, right? And that's the behavior that you see, is that act of walking across the street to get a sandwich. Do you think everyone who walks across the street to get a sandwich is hungry?
No.
What are other scenarios that might result in somebody walking across the street? Stress, there you go, exactly, good one. Perhaps a social engagement, right? Perhaps they're meeting someone. Exactly, a lunch meeting, exactly. And so what's really important to recognize is that those things are the observable behaviors that we see, and everybody has different drives that we can't see. And so something like this really dives into those things that perhaps aren't necessarily the observable behavior, but are the things that are really truly core to why we make the decisions that we do. Does that all make sense?
Yes.
So as we talked about, drives result in the needs and the things that help us satiate our drives, and those are the things that we see as a result, or the behaviors. So personal profiles, we'll get into a little bit of those graphs that everyone is questioning. And so you can see here we have the three graphs, the self concept, and the synthesis. So the self is essentially the answers to that second question that we answered, right? Who do you truly believe yourselves to be? And this is a visual representation of your basic motivations and needs. And we'll go through those factors again so we can revisit them, but just so you have an idea of what these graphs represent. The second graph is the self-concept, how you think you need to adapt in response to the current environment. So that's the answer to that first question. Who do you believe you need to be in your role? Who do you think others perceive you to be? All of those combinations of questions. This is the visual representation of what that means. And you can see too, this person that is represented here, you can see that their behaviors are very consistent. The graphs don't really change that much. Some of ours change a lot, right, which we'll get into. Yes?
I have a question about, maybe we'll go into it, about how that works, because I think the whole concept is the self-awareness, and so both questions kind of expect you to be self-aware.
That's absolutely right.
And if you have no self-awareness, you know, what is that? Yeah, I mean, it would just be, it could be totally different. So I don't know, like you say that people hire based on this. I'm just curious, how do they?
Absolutely, and so that's a great point. The distinguishing factor is when we do hire, we hire on the self. We have this information, because the self is who you truly naturally are, right? This is who you are in your most comfortable state. And so when we hire for positions,
or at least who you think you are.
This is who you think you are, right? So
I thought that was who you think people want you to be.
It's all of this. I would like kind of bucket it all into the same. It's perception, right? Like what is your perception of yourself as it relates to others or even your own self? But that's a great question, right? So when we hire, we base all of our decisions on the self, because this is who you believe you truly are, and we trust people to make that decision, right? And then this is more so, again, that perception piece of it. So, and that's why we ask it first, right? Because, you know, sometimes people try to fake the test, right? And that's going to happen with any assessment. But for something like this, it's a matter of getting that out of the way. And then, okay, question number 2. Oh, who am I really? Let's see. And then you go through the exercise of checking however many words out of those 86 adjectives that are listed there. And then you produces these results. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Great. And then the synthesis is the combination of these two graphs. And so one of the analogies we like to make, particularly in an interview process, a lot of times this is the person that shows up to the first interview or during the interview process. This is what we see initially.
And then the top one is who does the job.
This is probably 6 months, and this is probably like 30 to 60 days, right? So you can see, some people show up as they are, right? But there are others, as we can see, who adapt our behaviors based on our environment. And so to be aware of those things is really important as we interact with each other and make decisions for ourselves. So again, these are, again, a summary of the behavioral drives. I can send this to you as well if there's any other content that you're interested in seeing after. So walking through these a little bit in a little bit more detail. As we mentioned, this midpoint is really the average or the median, and then the higher expression results in these behaviors, and the lower expression results in these behaviors. I will say too, on your handout, there's a list of adjectives on the backhand side, just for your reference for going forward, if you ever want to reference it back. So for the A factor, for dominance, the need here is to make an impact or have a thumbprint. On the low end, it's to include others or collaborate. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
For extroverts, those who have a high expression, let me talk through it and work with others, let me collaborate, let me be social, etc. On the lows, on the low end, provide me with time and let me think it through. The more introspective approach. Patience. On the high end, I am most comfortable with familiarity, I like stability, I prefer more routine work. On the low end, I respond positively to pressure and need variety. High sense of urgency, really quick, really fast-paced. And finally, the D, or formality. On the higher end, give me a framework and structure. These people really like detail. On the low end, don't confine me to rules and structure, more of an informal approach to work, less detailed. And so reading the behavioral pattern, we can talk through, we talked a little bit about the midpoint, the expression of each of these behaviors. I will say too, you can see these sigmas up here. The farther away a factor is expressed from that midpoint, the more predictable they are, hence the name, the predictive index. And so for this person, their most predictable behavior is the C, because it falls within that third sigma. The second most are gonna be the A, B, and D factor. And then, of course, those who fall within the first sigma, those with factors within that first sigma, means that their behaviors are fairly flexible. So, for example, say a person has a B factor within the 1 sigma low, they're still going to appear as social when they're in their natural state, and it would be really easy for them to cross over and be that more outgoing person that they need to be. Who has factors? Who has at least one factor within this range?
On which map?
Within this 1 sigma on the self. The self, yes.
All 4 of mine are.
Okay, great. That's fantastic. Wow. That's great. That means you have very flexible behaviors, and so you tend to adapt depending on what your environment requires of you. Kirby is a very wide pattern. We, for the most part, know we get what we see, right? Yeah. That's exactly what that means, exactly. And this person too, right? We tend to, this person, 2 sigma high A, 2 sigma high B, 2 sigma low D, 3 sigma low C. This is a very quick person, very fast moving. They probably talk really fast. They probably have just a really quick method or pace of how they get work done. Questions? Yes.
Actually, okay, never mind. Keep going. I think maybe you'll get to it.
Okay, sounds good. Again, and these are the words that are on that handout that you have, so just to talk through some of the adjectives that describe the behaviors. So the higher the drive, the stronger the behaviors. Those with a high A tend to be really independent, competitive, self-starters, innovative, venturesome. They tend to be the let's go, kind of, the venturers. Could sometimes appear as controlling, perhaps confrontational, challenging authority, etc. Those on the lower end tend to be more accepting, collaborative, attentive, accommodating. These are just really nice people. For B, extraversion, on the high side you have the stimulating, enthusiastic, socially poised, usually the chatterboxes, right? Very open of themselves and expressive. Those on the low end tend to be more quiet, more introspective, reserved. Those on the extreme end tend to be somewhat hermit-ish, very private, and kind of tend to separate themselves from people. C, patience, on the high side, very deliberate, very unhurried, peaceful, tend to be more of the easygoing folks who work at at a more routine or methodical pace. Those on the low end tend to be, again, more fast, abrupt, rapid, can sometimes appear as impulsive. And then the D factor on the high side, again, more conservative, more thorough, careful, very, very detailed with rules, and tend to be very structured and dutiful. If they have a task and they're asked to complete it in a certain way, they'll make sure that they're very specific and intentional about solving it or presenting the information in the way that they were asked. Not really any room for interpretation. And then on the low end, completely opposite, right? Tend to be a little less concerned with rules, more flexible, not as worried, can appear to be a little bit more impulsive, and spontaneous as well. So we'll talk a little bit about putting this to work. So I really like this quote. Our careers, our companies, our personal relationships, and our very lives succeed or fail gradually, then suddenly, one conversation at a time. Does anyone want to offer their interpretation of what this means?
Everything's based on relationships.
Mm-hmm. That's true. That is absolutely right. Anybody else? Gets back to that awareness piece, right? So understanding who we are and how we come across in our conversations, and making sure that we're coming across as we intend to come across, and being aware of how we tend to present, and tend to and how to understand how our behaviors are being expressed and communicated. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Awesome. So we'll do a little exercise with this handout in front of you here. So this is to help you understand and go through an exercise to be a more effective leader or team player on your team. So what I want you to do is think about your least desirable work relationship at this time. This can be someone that you work with that you just don't get along with, someone that whenever you work with them, it never results, it's kind of unproductive. So think about that person and think about their behaviors. So using those tools, plot the individual on this graph based on those factors that we talked about.
The other person.
The other person, yes. You're thinking about the other person.
Oh, goodness.
Oh.
And then going through that exercise, compare that to yourself. How are you similar? How are you different? And what can you do to improve this relationship? So first, go ahead and plot that, that individual on this graph, and then we can talk a little bit about questions 3 and 4 after you go through that exercise and think a little bit through it. Interesting. That's really good. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Great. Cool. So we'll move on. So putting it to work, we'll continue that conversation of how we can leverage our talent in their positions. This quote: "Were they dead when you hired them, or did you kill them?" So basically, the idea of, so you hired these people to fill these jobs. Are they in the right jobs? Because if they're in the right jobs, they're probably being really productive and contributing in a meaningful way. And if they're not, it's probably something that you did. Like, no joke. So just talking a little bit about the graphs, the zigzags, the way we use some of these tools is as it relates to job positions. So as you all participated in the behavioral assessment, there's a corresponding assessment for positions that allows us to understand the behavioral demands of jobs. And so when we go through a hiring process, we can match our candidates with the jobs as it relates to the profiles and see where the fits and gaps might be. And we'll go through an exercise in a minute. But these are some examples of enterprise phases. So for startup environments, these are some really great profiles for those types of roles. You can see they're the high, especially the high A, right? You see the high A kind of coming out, and then the low C are the common factors in that particular profile. For rapid growth mode, again, you kind of have the high A. The B can be somewhat flexible, and again, a low C. And then finally, for a more mature organization, the A is kind of less important. The B becomes a little bit more relevant, and especially the D for stability and task management, things like that.
Random side question
Yes.
/ comment.
Astrid, you're the last one, aren't you?
No, actually, I'm kind of horrified by how everything I am is flipped. Because everything, like the bottom two for each looks like,
Well, what other people
Yeah.
see you as is totally the last one.
I'm the same with Astrid. I know what you're saying.
yeah, my,
Instead of this way, I'm this way. Is that
Well,
the four
actually, hold
things?
on. We're only supposed to be looking at self, or are we looking at?
We're only
Self.
looking at the self for now, and then we can
Okay,
talk
I think
about
that's what was
the,
tripping me
Yeah,
up.
so
All right,
that's
self,
an assessment.
self.
So
I'm
this is
actually
like
more.
Okay.
Oh yeah, that's still
Yeah.
true. I'm still totally the.
Yep.
greater
So you're
than
actually not any of these.
No.
But you're.
Lovely.
You are not.
No.
A process of elimination.
So what does that mean?
And so, okay, and then so for how you're coming across, you're switching. Interesting. So you try to be way more patient.
Yeah, formal.
You try to be more
So
formal,
fascinating.
less dominant.
Way less. Yeah.
I'm
Interesting.
I'm sorry that you can't, like,
Yeah.
did you get to do the assessment beforehand?
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay, yeah. So sorry. If you RSVP'd, yeah, just to explain to anybody who showed up, if you RSVP'd ahead of time, she sent you an assessment that you could take so that you could get your results for this. For the people who are attending but didn't take it beforehand, okay, you guys can do it afterwards so that you can at least look at it.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to send it to you, and then we can each,
Yeah.
and if anyone just after this too, we can do one-on-ones and do
Interesting.
readbacks and learn more about what it means. Happy to do that. So salesperson, right? Different types of salespeople out there. There's so many, right? So for a new account hunter, like the person who needs to go out there and get new business, this is the high A and the high B are going to be relatively important, and as well as the low C, the high sense of urgency and the pace. For an existing account farmer, this person can be needs to be a little bit more detailed, a high D, to kind of manage all of the information as it relates to the person in the account. Less dominant, really. Dominance isn't necessarily required. If you want somebody who's a little bit more agreeable and still social and extroverted, and still has a low patience. Talking about technical versus collaborative, a technical hunter, the difference here is the high D, right? Someone who's more specific and specialized in their hunting or in their business development. And a collaborator, you can see the A and the B kind of flip. So here, the A over B, this is what we would call task focused. The B, when the B is higher than the A, we call them more people focused. So that's just like a factor combination thing we won't get too much into today, but that is really the key difference here. And then the D here as well doesn't necessarily need to be as high for the collaborator. And then management styles, again, we talked about the startup. The high D or the high A, is most important. And for a public or pre-backed company, the people factor is a little bit more important. And here the detail becomes a little bit more important as well. Call centers, inbound versus outbound. Again, inbound, just a really nice person, right? The low A, low B, really patient, detail oriented. The outbound is the hunter, the venturer, the let's go get some deals and close everything. And then marketing, traditional versus digital. Again, the traditional marketer is kind of like a persuasive salesperson. And then the digital marketer, again, needs to be a little bit more detailed, more kind of specialized in technique. That's really where that D comes from, as well as that. And then you can see the low patience is important in both. So I'll talk through an example. Does anyone have any questions to date? We good?
We're overwhelmed, there's so much.
I know, there's a lot of information.
I have
Yes,
questions.
yes.
The only thing I saw up there that you've gone through that seemed to even remotely fit me was the inbound calls person.
Okay.
And I did that briefly and I hated it.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, like, is there anything else my personality type would be suited to, the backwards?
Yeah, absolutely. We can talk about that offline.
Okay.
I'm happy to talk
fine.
through different
Unfortunately,
roles.
Astrid, that's your only option.
You're basically screwed.
This is like that test you took in high school that told you what job you're supposed to do.
No, but absolutely. We can absolutely talk through that. So we'll talk through a sales hunter is the job that we'll talk through. So a sales hunter is quick to connect with people, a natural juggler, really goal-oriented, risk-tolerant, and self-driven. So this is what that looks like, right? We have the high A, the high B, the low C, the flexible D, recommended behaviors for the position. And now we have Heather, who is a results seeker. She's a perfectionist. She prefers tasks over people. She's a little bit slower to connect. This is her profile. Not exactly aligned, right? She's actually a very successful salesperson, does a very good job at generating revenue, closing deals, actually very effective. But I'm just going to skip through these things because they're a little confusing. However, she has a lot of adjustments to make, right? So her B, as you can see, is very low, and in this role, this role requires her to be a 2 sigma high B, right? So you can see kind of the difference in what her natural behavior is and what the job actually requires. So she's changing a lot, right? Like she's physically adjusting a lot to this position in order to be successful, right? The second part, or the second big change that she makes is her C, right? She's a relatively patient person, right, at that midpoint, right? And then she notches it down 2 sigmas to be a relatively impatient, fast-paced, quick worker type of person. Also probably very uncomfortable, right? So how do we, the D, kind of less, it's probably the least significant change that she has to make, but she becomes, she does cross the midpoint and becomes less detailed. And so, yes.
Question.
Yes.
From an employer standpoint,
Yes.
if they saw what she was and what she needed to be and saw that it was so dramatic, would they then just assume she wasn't the right person for the job, or would they think, oh, that's something we can train her to do?
Absolutely, it's a really good question. And so, in what we try to share, PI or psychometric assessments are one data point, right? We go back to the concept of the whole human, the head, the heart, and the briefcase. This is one aspect of who shows up to work. And so, and people are very flexible. Like we can do things, we can learn things, we can perform to expectations, really depending on our will and how much we want to commit to something, right? There's all kinds of factors that are involved with it. And so to make that point, this is one data point, right? So as we kind of talked about, she is doing very well at sales. She's a very successful person. The point is that she's not necessarily as comfortable as she could be in the role, and therefore it might not be as sustainable over the long term, right? So, you know, she could probably fake it for 2-3 years. You know, like I've probably been an accountant for 2-3 years, but that's not gonna work for me for the long term, you know, like, cause I can, based on my behaviors, and I'm relatively flexible in my detail, relatively flexible in my stability, so I can adapt to various situations quite comfortably. But in my most natural, I'm an extrovert, and sitting at a computer behind a desk for all hours of the day is not going to satisfy me for the long term, right? Again, probably something I could do for 2-3 years, but over the long term, probably not sustainable. So that's a lot of what this talks about, is the predictability of job performance, right? So if we find opportunities that align behaviorally with who we are, that means that we can perform more consistently over a longer period of time, and therefore be more productive and less concerned about adjusting our behaviors to suit a job, and focus all of our energies on actually performing the job. Does that make sense?
I wish it was possible for a job position to take this assessment so that I could see like what the job needs you to be and what you actually are.
Actually, it does. That is one of the aspects of this.
Can a job
It does.
take it?
You,
Can
so
my
what?
job take this
So what
assessment?
it does actually? Can a job actually take it?
Yeah.
No, but can the hiring manager take it? What we actually do for the sales position here, or the job assessment, we can combine results of people like the hiring manager, the people in the jobs, the direct reports, and actually make a kind of combined graph of that, or we have individual people take it. But that's a big part of what we use for hiring, right? Like for hiring an account executive, for example, very similar to this profile. And we look at our candidates, we can go through this exact exercise and help understand, okay, what are these person's natural behaviors, what are the behaviors required of the job, and then we can tailor our interview questions accordingly to help us understand how they might perform in this role and how they might adjust their behaviors in order to perform in that role. And you would never not hire someone because they have the wrong PI, because that's just not a thing. Again, the whole person shows up at work. And so, depending on the nature of the position, if it's a temp job and you need someone to do something for a finite period of time, then, this PI is really helpful, but it's not necessarily something that is going to be the defining reason why you select someone or not. Does that make sense? So.
Just to add
Of course,
to that,
yes.
being as an employment
Yes.
agency,
Yes.
People tend to style flex when you're interviewing them.
Absolutely.
So, and also in workforce development, you could be, they may not present very well, but they're great workers and they can fit well. They're just not presenting themselves as well as they should relative to that job. So
It's absolutely.
you can't really look at this singularly.
It's a great point. And to that point, when people show up for jobs, ideally they're on their best behavior, right? They're bringing their best self, or what their interpretation of their best self is, right? And so as we saw those 3 graphs, That's why we pay ideally in a person's most natural state. That's who's going to show up to the job day in and day out, not the self-concept, not the synthesis.
Check out the Facebook page.
Does that all make sense? Great. One of the things too, I'll add. I have 1 o'clock, Kirby. Can I go over a little bit?
Yeah.
Is that all right?
Well, I mean, unless.
Are we?
Yeah.
Are we
I would
okay
go
on
ahead
time?
If anybody has to bounce at 1 o'clock, you were free to leave, but we don't recommend it. But you can. All right. Then.
I don't have many more slides.
Let's continue.
Great. And so.
I'm fascinated, so.
Some of the things that some other applications of these results are coaching to a person's highest drive. So basically, what that means, if a person, if their highest drive is an A versus a B versus a C versus a D, those are the things that we can coach to if they're not necessarily performing well in their job. So for those with their factors of highest A, does anyone have high A? Is there most perfect? Awesome. So for someone like you guys, what might be helpful if you're having trouble with your manager or having trouble on the team, it's redefining the win, right? Like, what does the win look like? What does the actual end goal look like? And that will help those of us with a high A to help figure out where we should allocate our energy and our drive to in a way that's beneficial to the group. Those with a high B, who's extreme high B, me. How are you being perceived? So understanding how you're coming across versus your social, with your social inclinations, how fast you're talking. I tend to talk really fast. I'm sorry if I talk really fast today. And really understanding what that is, and then making adjustments depending on the needs of your team. C for patience, those with a really high C, design a new process, understanding what the process requires, what the end goal requires, and adjusting to understand and acclimate to that so that you're contributing in a meaningful way to the team. And then finally a D, those with a really high D, redefine what the rules are. High Ds require a lot of structure, and so kind of understanding what those goals are, defining the rules around what those goals are so that you can perform in a way, again, that contributes to the team in a meaningful way. So this is the last kind of section. We'll talk a little bit about leveraging your team dynamics using these team analytics with an example. So Alan's a head of sales. He needs feedback, opportunity to influence, and is a really people-focused connector. Mark is a CEO. He's actually really direct, data-oriented, oh God, operationally focused. That's like my nightmare. And so these are comparing their two profiles. So as you can see, I'll point out the visuals in a second, but two totally different people, right? Totally different behaviorally.
Do their styles match the job that they're in, though?
That's a really good question. Let's go through that exercise. So Alan, as the head of sales, this is what we would call, what is this? This is a persuasive salesperson. And so as you can see, he's high B, so super extrovert, relatively low A, so really nice person, really comes across very amicably. Low C, kind of a faster person, but again, relatively moderate, so he'll flex, and again, D as well, flexible on his detail. Mark self-pattern, high A, 2 sigma, high A, oh God. Low B, so kind of an introvert. They're both relatively impatient, and then Mark's actually pretty detail-oriented. And so
I feel like to be a good CEO, you should probably have a little bit more on the patient side to deal with.
Or at least flex to the patients, right? So their behavioral comparison, the blend of these two, we can kind of see where the differences are, right? So the A is super different, right? Super opposite ends of the spectrum, and the B as well, very, very different. So where Alan, the head of sales, craves feedback and craves that kind of social stimulation, Mark is not really willing to do that. He's not necessarily that person who's going to give that kind of feedback naturally, right, or organically. And then you also have the dominance. Mark is very dominant, whereas Alan is not so much. He's very, again, very friendly, just people-oriented and amicable, which we just talked about. So you can see the difference there. That's like 2 sigmas, 2.5 sigmas different, and same there, about 2.5 sigmas of difference. And then the C is a little bit different, but they're both low, so it's not as obvious or not as impactful in their relationship. In the D, this could be, depends on how it shows up, considering other factors of their behaviors. But because Mark is a little bit more detail oriented, he's going to expect a little bit more information from Alan, and Alan's probably not going to give it because that's not his natural way to communicate. So again, different needs, different behaviors. And so kind of understanding this is something that I would share. We actually have tools within the software that allow us to produce questions that help coach individuals, whether it be a manager in a direct report or peers or team members, to help ask them questions on how to vet these challenges and what are some things in regards to expectations. Setting expectations is huge in anything. Like if there's anything that I can share not related to psychometrics, it's about expectations and setting expectations with your team and committing to those expectations and being accountable for them is really important. And then understanding how we show up at work and what those implications are and how we relate to each other is super important. Tying it back to the awareness piece.
So would that be something that you would advise them to not work with each other, or just to be more aware of the differences to work better with each other?
That's a great question. And so I will always say sometimes you just can't work with somebody. I've been in situations like that too. That's really hard, and it's not productive for the company, and then a change needs to be made. I will always suggest first having the conversation and setting those expectations and communicating with the other person or people where there might be challenges or where the conflicts might arise, and then working through to a solution that you can all be accountable to and agree on. But to Kirby's point, sometimes there are situations where that just happens, where it happens that you are really unable to work with someone despite, whether it be their behaviors or their work style or whatever type of factor that we're talking about. It's always important to go through the exercise and really understand the person, but sometimes that does happen. It does happen. And this is my last slide, I think, of content. So PI, kind of talk through just a lot of the self-awareness piece of it, but these are all of the things that it does from an analysis and workforce analytics perspective. As we talked about the job assessments, really great for hiring and onboarding. It relates to employee engagement and retention, making sure people are in the right jobs once they're in your organization. Sometimes people get promoted or moved laterally, and so understanding what roles would best take advantage of who they are behaviorally and having the conversation around that. Team development, sometimes companies go through a reorg, you go through M&A, and you're trying to decide who to keep and who to let go, and this is a good tool to help with that. Discovering high potentials in leaders, again, as we talk through the different profiles for sales management and enterprise sales, all those types of things, understanding the best roles going forward for individuals as it relates to succession planning. And then sales, too. There are a lot of different types of salespeople out there and different roles that salespeople can be very good at, and so understanding what that looks like and how to take advantage of those behaviors and make sure that they produce in a meaningful way for the company and also for themselves. Does anyone have any questions?